do you think they shrink in the wash?
Possibly.
And the colour will come out?
No, the colour never comes out.
Oh, really? But if they shrink? Fucked.
Preference.
Well,
I'll have to dye it.
Then they just
I don't
come.
know why. I just like to hear, I don't listen to it, I just do it.
Yeah.
Is it being recorded by these people or not?
I think so.
Oh, well, then I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, it's a good session.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, I'm Parul Sehgal. I'm an editor at the New York Times Book Review. Thank you so much for coming out. You can't? Sound? Hello? Better? Okay. Thanks so much for coming out and enduring the chill. I hope we'll warm you up. Just to let you know, we're going to chat for about 40 minutes and then open it up for questions for about 15 minutes or so. So it's a huge privilege for me to be in the company of my personal pantheon, Sarah Waters, Deepti Kapoor, Hanif, Kureishi, Nicholson Baker, who so kindly assembled here to talk dirty to us for about 40 minutes. And our subject today is sex, writing about sex, the pleasures, the pitfalls. And these four writers have written about desire in almost every register and every mode. They've taken us from Edwardian London to modern-day Delhi to a camp catering to our every possible sexual fetish. And we're very lucky to have them here today. So just by way of introduction, Hanif Kureishi has told stories in almost every medium we possess. He's a playwright, screenwriter, and filmmaker. His novels include The Buddha of Suburbia, The Black Album, and most recently, The Last Word. Deepti Kapoor has written a dark, very unhinged, very beautiful first novel called A Bad Character. Sarah Waters is the author of 6 universally acclaimed novels with some of the most dazzling plot twists in all of literature, including Fingersmith and most recently The Paying Guests. And Nicholson Baker is the author of 10 novels and 5 works of nonfiction, including The Mezzanine and Box. His awards include the National Book Critics Circle Award, and he has the distinction of coming up with some of the most amazing and disturbing sexual metaphors and euphemisms that we possess. I think The Millions has a nice glossary. So before we begin, I wanted to talk to you not just as writers, but first as readers. And I was wondering about what was the first most sort of seminal, most influential book about sex and desire that you came across that shaped your sensibility or angered you or provoked you? The first book that you remember. Maybe Deepti?
Well, I don't really remember as a child. Can you hear me? No? Now? Yeah, okay. I can hear myself. Okay. Now? Okay, I'm holding it. So, I don't remember reading anything as a child which was like a work of, say, like literature. I mean, I just remember going through my father's penthouse forums, and they had a big influence on me at that point of time. Later, in the last few years, when I started to write and I was in Goa, I read Dura, I read Kavan, I read Jane and Paul Bowles, and that influenced my writing, my structure, and sense of style. But as a child, it was I used to just go through his bookshelf, and there'd be all these like strange books, racy, pulpy thrillers, and I really enjoyed them. And I guess somewhere they might have seeped into my consciousness, but that's
the
how it
penthouse
started.
influence in your novels can be felt.
Possibly.
I'd like to say I'm much older than most of you here, but it was very odd because in the old days, by which I consider the old days to be the 1950s and through the early 60s, you never got to see pictures of people without their clothes on.
Yeah.
It was really hard to see pictures of people without their clothes on. And if you wanted to come into contact with pornographic material, which I and many of my friends wanted to do, it was a terrible thing. You had to read it. Now, if you want to come into contact with pornographic material, who would ever think of reading a book? Can you believe it? What an absurd thing to do. And so, like Deepti, I had to go to into my parents' bedroom to find out where the dirty stuff was. And of course, in my day, it would be Lady Chatterley's Lover. It would be Henry Miller. It was Nabokov. I mean, literature, you would be so desperate for sexual stimulation that you would even have to come into contact with literature. And later on, when we wanted to see images of sexuality, we then had to go and see European films, European movies, mostly French movies. So this is just to set the context of how desperate things were before and what happy, lucky, liberated people you are in terms of what we had to go through.
Well, I suppose, like Deepti, and like lots of people, my first exposure to writing about sex was probably rather pulpy stuff, rather trashy stuff that was passed around at school. That actually, looking back, probably wasn't that racy, but I can remember some James Herbert novels, for example, that had some sex scenes, I think. And sort of by definition, they were slightly sort of unpleasant somehow, and certainly their depictions of women weren't especially nice, but it was kind of all you had. And an added complication for me then as a young woman was that I was gay, and so it was much, much harder, even harder, to find nice images, positive images of lesbian sex, lesbian desire. You know, I mean, all gay people will have this experience of being hungry for any sort of image you can find, that to sort of just something that's a bit like you. And what was around tended to be rather male. I mean, it was very, you know, Brideshead Revisited, I remember being very excited about as a teenager because it had this homoerotic relationship between two men. And I remember Jeanette Winterson, I think, was a big writer for me in lots of ways. First, because she was just writing very ambitious literary fiction with a very unembarrassed lesbian agenda. And I think a book like The Passion, which is not, it's not a sexual book, but she writes about desire between women, and she writes about it very sparely and very beautifully and very honestly, and that was the first time I remember holding a book in my hands that seemed, to speak to me.
In one hand, I would imagine.
Oh.
Yeah.
Lower the tone. We're only 5 minutes in, for goodness sake.
Well, I think the first dirty book I read was probably The Family of Man, which was a Time Life book, and it was a beautiful book with pictures of everything, just life all over the world. But there was this one set of pictures in which a baby was born, and nobody had any clothes on. It was incredibly exciting for a young person. And I think then somebody brought a really racy book into class in 3rd grade, and there was all kinds of strange words, and we kind of poured and studied this book and tried to understand it. It was mystically exciting, but we didn't really get it. And then another thing happened, which was my best friend was walking to my house when we were about, 11, and there was a paper bag on the sidewalk, and he picked it up, and there were 2 nudist magazines in the paper bag.
What a gift.
Sort of if somebody had just sort of left it for him to encounter.
Yeah.
And he came back, and he came running up, to 2 magazines, my God. We just looked through these magazines, and we didn't know what, they're naked people, They were on swings, and they were always happy. Nudists are always so happy. And then I quickly slid them back in the paper bag and hid them in a very secret place until the house cleaner found them. And then my mother confronted me with it and said, "This is very strong stuff. Are you sure you're ready for this?" And I said, "Well, I think I'm ready, yeah."
They're on swings.
Yeah.
Okay, but we were talking a bit about images, but can we talk a little bit about what the particular power of putting desire and writing about sex into language and narrative does?
Well, I would say that desire and sex are different anyway.
Oh, okay, what's the distinction?
I mean, Anna Karenina is a book about desire. It's also, I guess, implicitly a book about sex, but Tolstoy, being a very wise man, doesn't describe really them having sex. And I would say the sexual act is very, very difficult to describe successfully. It's really difficult to describe almost anything that's really traumatic and difficult. Well, I guess which is why we admire writers like Shakespeare so much, because somehow, imagine that you have a really great night of sex, and then you want to describe it either to a friend or you want to write about it in your journal. And you can always say, you always have to say, I couldn't find the words. There are never the words. It's always indescribable. There's always something about it in your description that will be banal and somehow will escape you. And you'd have to say, well, that's the nature of experience in language in itself, but particularly with a very transformative experience like sexuality, it's almost impossible to find a way of describing that isn't banal. And that's very odd when you think of what a profound and a significant experience what one can have in a sexual encounter. Yeah. So usually it's a good idea to leave it out and to show, you might say, through the characters' lives, what that sexual experience meant to them.
Oh, and in the denial as well. Well, for me, it was, the power came from transgression, from pushing boundaries and taboos, especially in India, where women don't, let alone think about sex. They don't ever write about it. What will my mother say? What will my grandmother say? So you kind of live in a very reduced society. You have, you just have secrets, and you have secret lives. So the erotic writing was not about the act
There's
itself.
An urgency. There's a political component.
It was extremely political, and it was just like working within that tension of basically being a woman who wants sex, who has desire, but also living in a society that says no, this is wrong. Yeah. So I was working within that tension, and also finding a way of accessing the world with the same sort of like swollen ownership and swagger that male novels have. Mm-hmm. How do you do that? That was what I was trying to do. So.
Yeah. How about you, Sarah?
Well, I was just going to pick up on something that Hanif says, because I think that's an interesting thing about sex and desire, that it continually sort of seems to evade language. It's continually bigger than our capacity to contain and describe it. But then isn't that a challenge for us as writers? That we can, well, in the West especially, we continually see images of sex, and of course they're always seamless and perfect, and the bodies involved are kind of, perfect young bodies. And of course sex in real life is so much more complicated than that, and messier than that, and more interesting than that for those reasons. And so I think it's something worth striving for as an author. There are moments when it's appropriate or more powerful not to describe something explicitly, but I think there are other times, if you're writing, there's nothing worse than a sort of gratuitous sex scene, and that's might sound like a rather prim thing to say, but I mean it, if the sex is just kind of there for the sake of it, it's really off-putting. But I think if you're writing a novel in which the sex is significant for a character, if they're having some sort of sexual adventure, if they're discovering themselves or their place in the world through a sexual encounter, as might be the case in Deepti's novel, and has certainly been the case in some of mine, then I think it's kind of appropriate and a challenge to try and capture that somehow in language.
I think it's different actually in the West, because you're talking about how writing about sex in India is a taboo. Well, you might say in the West, or certainly in Britain and the US, it's almost a taboo not to write about it. Sexuality is represented everywhere all the time, and we live in a world, you might say, of generalized perversions. And almost everything in the newspapers every single day is about some or other politician having sex. It is amazing to think how much sex politicians have. When you read the newspapers, you think, our lives are so dull compared to I don't know, the Minister for Home Affairs or the Minister for Finance. They are at it like animals 24/7. But I think that makes it even more difficult to write about sex freshly, to write about it in a new way, to write about it in an interesting way, and to show what it might mean in somebody's life, because in a sense the imperative now in the West is the imperative to have sex all the time. And really what everybody worries about in London, I have no idea whether in India you're worrying about this all the time. Everybody in London worries about whether they're having enough sex, and whether they're having the right kind of sex, and whether they're utilizing the most exciting positions and so on. And it's become a terrible trauma. And so all my life we've wanted to be liberated. Let's put it crudely, from the 50s until the present, we wanted to be liberated from the taboo of not being able to think and talk and have the kind of sex we wanted to have. Now we have it, it's even worse, I have to say. So I wouldn't necessarily say that you've got a lot to look forward to.
Nick, I wanted to get your perspective also on the challenge of putting sex into language. And I don't think anybody has, as I said in my introduction, the amount of words that you've invented to describe coitus is phenomenal. So,
well, that's nice of you.
No, but
well, the challenge that I faced, well, I had written very chaste books. My first book was about a man riding an escalator, not much sex. The second book was about a man giving a bottle to a newborn baby. The third book was about John Updike. That's not very sexy. And I remember thinking, you know, there's more to life. There's this huge, rich area. But the literary novels, this was back in 1990, the literary novels of the time had a certain pattern, which is that you read along and you met the characters and you got to know them, and then they had sex. And suddenly you were in this sort of trench. And it was, and they used special vocabulary and everything, and then they finished. And then they climbed out, and then they were in the literary novel again. And then, oh my God, another sex scene, flump, and they're down in it. And you think, oh, don't do it. I don't want to hear about it. You know, just help us. I like literary novels. I don't need to read about sex. I don't want that. But what if, and yet sex is, as Hanif said, it's the ancient subject. It's the thing we think about a lot. It deserves literary inspection. So I decided to take those moments, one of those moments where they're having sex, and stretch it out so that the whole book was one gigantic sex scene. Okay? Vox. But they don't see each other. You know, they're on the phone. This was a new thing in 1990. You're talking to somebody, you don't see her, she doesn't see you, you're talking. You have to actually become sort of co-fantasists and create a world together that is exciting. So the idea was to create a novel that was one big sex scene in which people actually didn't see each other, and yet something good happened by the end. It had a happy ending. So that was how I worked it out.
I'm very happy that you brought up Vox, because I wanted to talk about these moments in the culture when certain novels break out. As you mentioned, Lady Chatterley's Lover. You could talk about Colette's Gigi novels. You could talk about, in the 60s, we had Roth, we had Updike. When you have novelists that are not only writing about sex, but they seem to be reporting from some kind of frontier. And they seem to be saying, this is something that's happening. And suddenly in the 60s, you're like, there are these threesomes. There's this thing called fellatio. There's this, you know, and I wanted to know now, at this moment in the novel, are there frontiers that are being explored? As Vox sort of showed everybody that this is a way, this is a new radical form of intimacy, this is a kind of sex, this is a kind of sexual imagination. Are there frontiers that you're seeing that need to be explored in the novel, or are being?
I think the most radical thing now would be to write about a happy marriage. I think that would be so unusual and so original, it would seem so far out. Look, there's these two people, and they just love each other, and they want to have sex with each other. There's nobody else involved, they really like each other. Yeah, they like each other for a long time. Woo.
Oh, sorry.
How about you, Deepti?
Well,
I think your book is exploring a frontier.
Yeah, that's what, see, so different now between what's happening, say, in the West, in England, America, and what's happening here. There is, you know, so many taboos still here that just waiting to be broken.
Right.
So when I did start writing, I was very like, okay, I'm going to be a good prim girl. I'm going to write a proper story, a proper novel. And then I just said, fuck it, you know what? I'm just going to try and do this. I was terrified when it came out. You know, oh my God, this is out in the world, family, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, everyone just gets over it. You're going to die one day. So that's how I think about things, you know.
That's the spirit.
Just go ahead and do it. And that's why I think, you know, I mean, you know, there are many girls who've actually come up to me and like told me their secret sexual lives as a result of me writing this novel. There's been a lot of backlash as well, but there's been, you know, women who've said, you know, we're like that. You know?
They're feeling seen for the first time.
Yeah, and there's other women, like women who maybe have dysfunctional lives, who maybe don't come from very liberal families, and at the same time they desire. And then it's just nice to read that kind of account of someone else who's had that. So, you know, and then also write about, I mean, it's sex, but it's also drugs. I mean, drugs is very taboo in India, so I wanted to do both. So anyway.
I wanted to know about shock. Do we have, and maybe Nick, you can start with this a little bit. I'm thinking about House of Holes and thinking about, do you feel, do writers have an obligation to sort of stretch, to play with our collective sort of erotic imagination, push things, test things out, try things?
Well, it's a complicated thing because I think privacy is a beautiful thing. Embarrassment, that kind of wonderful intimacy. I am a happily married man. I wrote Vox by sort of interviewing my wife. So the idea is, but a book is something that you open and you descend into it, and it swirls around in your mind, and you could do all kinds of crazy, forbidden things, and you might as well see what happens. So it's on the one hand, sometimes like at a dinner party, people think that because you're a sex writer, you're going to want to sit and just talk about sex all night long. Well, of course not. I mean, I'm just a human being. I want to be private. I want to be polite. Yeah. Because politeness is beautiful. We're human beings. We don't want to suddenly leap up here and start taking our clothes off. There's a reason we have clothes, you know? So, on the other hand, there are these moods, there are moments in life where you want to think a different way. You want to open a book. You want to descend into that world. And that's where things can start to, go in all kinds of directions for me that I didn't know they were going. And I must say that the nice thing about writing, I've written a lot of books, and only a few of them are about sex. But the ones that I wrote that are about sex were by far the most fun to write, because typing slows you down. And you're slowly imagining something that's happening that would happen in real time, but you're watching a whole scene happen in very slow motion. It's incredibly arousing, actually. It's really fun. Yeah. I recommend it to everyone. Just start typing a sex scene. Have a beer,
See where the night takes you.
Yeah.
What about you, sir? Do you have a similar feeling as you're writing narrative sex scenes? Where are you in relationship to the content?
Well, I think there's all sorts of things for me writing, because my novels have tended to be about lesbians in historical novels, but with lesbian protagonists. So, like Deepti, I think I felt there's been a political dimension for that to that for me. That I've wanted to. But when I first started writing in the 90s, it was a time in the UK when the lesbian and gay community was becoming very confident, and there was a lot of life in it, and it felt very, very easy for me to write about lesbian identity and lesbian sex because lots of writers had done it before me, including Jeanette Winterson. My Beautiful Laundrette was a big, big film for me at that time, And so it felt like, I think there had always been this lesbian feminist anxiety, say in the 80s, that if we wrote about lesbian sex, men would get it. It would be read in the wrong way. But I think we'd sort of shaken that off a bit by the 90s, and I felt I had a community of readers, and if it found mainstream readers too, that would be great, and that it was important to write frankly and in a celebratory kind of way about lesbian sex, because even now, if you do see representations of lesbian sex in mainstream, it tends to be in pornography overwhelmingly, which is, often authored by men, kind of aimed at men, and often men step in actually at the crucial moment and take over. Or our idea of lesbian relationships, that it tends to be rather cozy, that they're romantic, that they're about holding hands and snuggling, that kind of thing. So to me, it's always felt important to try and write sort of truthfully and, as I say, sort of unembarrassedly about...
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Because you do a lot of research for your books, and you sort of resurrected all kinds of lesbian relationships from all over history. Can you tell us a little bit about the research and how you have, where you find sort of details, information about how women lived at that time?
Yes, well, yeah, because I write historical fiction, and 3 of my novels were set in the 19th century. The most recent 3 have been set in the early 20th century. And this is something that fascinates me about history and about sex, that we tend to think of sex as something that takes us outside of history, outside of our bodies, you know, outside of culture. But of course, sex is always performed in a culture. And you know, it depends completely on our cultural and historical moment, what we think is appropriate, how we think about our bodies, how we have sex. Those very intimate things that we do are completely dependent. I mean, you know, things that we thought were intimate in the 80s, you know, that's all shifted when I was a teenager. That's changed, you know, in the past sort of 20, 30 years. So to go back to the Victorian period or go back to the 1920s, for me, is trying to think about, well, how would people have felt about their bodies? What would they have felt comfortable about exposing? Would they have had oral sex? You know, how would they actually have had sex? And of course, that sort of information doesn't tend to be in the mainstream historical record. You have to look at diaries or read between the lines a lot of the time. Look at autobiography, sexual memoir. Pornography, to a certain extent, tells you something. It's always a fantasy, but nevertheless, it kind of tells you something about sexual mores. So it's been a question of acting on those hints and fragments and sort of, you know, trying to build something around them. And also, to come back to Hanif's point about, you know, not being too explicit, I think also in different historical periods, very small gestures have been incredibly erotic. You know, when you're a teenager, things can be incredibly loaded and you're not really doing very much, but they're mind-blowing. And I think that's been something that I've thought about a lot too in the Victorian period. You know, a glance, a certain kind of glance can be incredibly charged, or the touch of a hand, the brush of a hand, or the brush of a skirt. You know, fantastically erotic.
I mean, and you also mentioned Jeanette Winterson, so there's a whole kind of writing that can be so charged with eros and sexuality and be completely, you know, unchoreographed. There can be no act described, but that's just the sort of charge. Hanif, just going, following up on what Sarah said and how all sex is sort of like culturally mediated, so much of your work, from My Beautiful Laundrette, The Book of Suburbia, it talks about how sex sort of brings people into, or desire brings people into a certain kind of political consciousness. And I was wondering about the political component in your own writing about sex and desire.
Well, I guess I always thought that we are desiring machines, the way in which we desire. I think Sarah was saying something similar. The way in which we desire is cultural. And that's why we have to keep on writing about it. The way people desired in the 50s is not the same as they desired in the 70s and tomorrow, and so on. So it has to be continuous. But I was thinking about My Beautiful Laundrette. There's a scene in My Beautiful Laundrette when Daniel Day-Lewis is a white skinhead and kisses a gay Pakistani boy played by Gordon Warnack. And this is the mid-80s, so it's not that long ago, but it was very shocking. It was very unusual to see boys or men kissing in the cinema then, actually. You never saw it. Now you see it all the time. You can't get away from it. In fact, particularly you see it during football matches, I find. So there would be a strong desire to carry on shocking people, and I think that would be an awful treadmill to get involved in. So I think you have to find a new way of writing about sex. I think Sarah's idea that you can go back and look at the way people have thought about sex historically is a good idea. But I think the other way to think about sex is to think about how much people hate sex. And what a terrible thing it is and how horrible it is. And how resistant people are to having sex. And how painful it is to have sex and how traumatic it can be. You know, you remember when you're young and you first hear about it and you think, my God, and then they do that, my God. I mean, really, do they actually, can they, you know? And it's always shocking in a sense for a young person, and there's something always traumatic about sex and always something new about sex. There's always something in sex that is beyond our ability to describe it, and there's always something in sex which has the possibility of being so revolutionary and having the possibility of changing our lives that I can understand what you were saying, that people wouldn't want to think about that. They would make it into taboo because it is so revolutionary and it could change your life so suddenly. And who would want that?
Just to talk about the sort of lesbian revolution, I found, after I published Vox, and it had a little success, and I was kind of pleased with myself, I thought, I'm Mr. Pornographer. And then my wife and I and our child moved to Berkeley because we had enough money to live in Berkeley because of the book. And there was, in the Bay Area in San Francisco, was this place called Good Vibrations. Okay, it's a sex shop. But there was a woman there named Susie Bright, who is sort of an inspiration to me, because she wasn't shocking. She didn't want to shock. She just wanted to be true. Yeah. She just wanted to fling her sexuality out at an audience. And I found that really exciting, you know, that she wanted to be real, and she wanted to be truer, and she would have these sort of film festivals and things like that. And I thought, man, I'm in trouble because this woman is way ahead of me. Yeah. So I then wrote The Fermata, which was about my adolescent sexual fantasy of stopping time. Yeah. When you stop time, you can do anything you want. Yeah. So think about that. Yeah. So that's how I tried to keep up with
Susie Bright.
Susie Bright. Yes.
Well, following up on that, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of sex and writing about sex and political correctness. Oh, hello. Better? Oh my God, I don't mean to yell at you. So just talking a little bit about sex and fantasy and political correctness. There was like an essay that came out a few years ago in the Times Book Review by the American critic, whose name is escaping me right now. And she was criticizing the younger generation of male writers, David Foster Wallace, Michael Chabon, with Katie Roiphe was the essay, sorry, and saying that instead of sex in a lot of novels being written by young American men, there was a lot of tedious cuddling, because these men were afraid if they were to actually write about their fantasies, they would be considered misogynist. So they were rejecting the sort of tradition of sexual writing, like Updike, Roth. So I wanted to talk to all of you a little bit about finding that freedom, finding that abandon, finding that space. You know, nobody wants to be criticized in misogyny, but we want to write deeply and interestingly and in complicated ways about what we like or what we think our characters like, right? So, Deepti.
Well, that's interesting because desire is messy. It's often not politically correct. Right. There's a scene in my novel where the protagonist Ida and her lover are walking down a street in Old Delhi in Chandni Chowk, and they end up following a group of two Muslim women who are completely covered, and her lover loves the fact that they're covered, and she, so he desires her, he makes a sport of them, and then she goes along with it, so she desires with him. So she objectifies the women, but she's also objectifying herself, and that was the point, that's what it does. But it can be taken in like, oh my God, you're a woman, and you're writing about this, you're not with the cause, but so that's the thing, you can't, when you're writing about sex, when you're writing about desire, you can't, it's messy, it's complicated, it's going to go into places that people are uncomfortable with, but you've just, that's what you have to do. I mean, maybe it is deeply feminist at another level, but
then there's a problem for writers, isn't there? Because you want to capture, you want to do justice to that messiness, that untidiness, and perhaps, the non-politically correct side of desire. But once you commit something to paper, once you publish something and it's out in the world, it does take on a certain status. I mean, you might want to write about female masochistic desire, for example, fascinating. But then to create a text or a film that's about female masochism, aren't you just adding to all the stuff, all the rubbish we have in the world about that women are essentially masochistic? I mean, don't we have a responsibility as writers to hold back sometimes? I don't know.
I know, this is kind of a balancing act that you have to...
Well, sex isn't an equal opportunities thing, is it? It's not like that. I mean, you might really want to be a slave, and you might really want to be dominated, but it doesn't mean that when you leave the house in which you want to be a slave that you really do want to be a slave. I mean, that would be absurd. But the idea of there being equality in a sexual relationship is a ludicrous thing, because you may want to be humiliated, you want to maybe degraded, and you may go the other way too. The idea that you can have politically correct sex would be hopeless and impossible, and it wouldn't be any fun at all. If you're not really humiliated, it seems to me you're not doing it right at all. So I think we really have to make a separation between the agreement that sexual partners might make, in which they might want to take part in various practices, but you wouldn't necessarily want to do that as a political leader of a nation. Unless you were Kim Jong-un, one of my great heroes.
I have the misfortune that I think all of my desires are politically correct. Right? I don't feel the desire to do forbidden things. I just feel the desire to do interesting things and think about them slowly. You know, the pleasure of that is. On the other hand, you know, the thing that I think is great about writing about sex as opposed to making a video or, you know, we have lots of ways of looking at sex now that we never had before. And the great thing about writing is that you don't see anything. You just have the words. The embarrassing thing for me, I mean, I've watched porn. I was a generation that grew up on pornography, so I've seen an awful lot of it, and I've learned a lot from it. But the problem is that it's naked. It's so naked that you can't really think straight. You know, it's actually not funny. And I think that the nice thing about writing about sex is funny. Yeah. Okay, it's hilarious, and so if you get to write about a sex scene and people do ridiculous things and you don't have to see them naked, it's much funnier. If you see them naked, it's always embarrassing because the first thing you think of is, oh God, there's no clothes, you know. So I think the great thing about books about sex, unless they're disturbing and dark, which is another nice genre that I don't know anything about, dungeons I don't know anything about, but people nice people sharing orgasms and also being funny, I think is a space that prose can inhabit that videos can't.
I love that. So I'd like to invite anybody who has any questions. Sure, sir, right here in the front. Do we have a mic or something?
Hi, my question is for Hanif. You talked about politics of, am I audible?
Yeah.
You talked about politics of sex, actually. What about the sexual writing being in clash with the literary tradition? Do you think too much sexuality kind of limits the literary power of a book? And why do literary writers kind of haze away from sexual writing?
That's a good question.
Well, I think literary writers have written about sex. I think Middlemarch is a book about sex, for instance, in some form or another. I think most great literature, Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina, are both books about desire and the desire, let's say, to live a conventional life, and the desire to be with the body of someone who really turns you on. And this is a terrible conflict. So I don't think literary writers have evaded it, and I think Sarah's right. I think you can write about it in all kinds of oblique ways without, and making it quite clear to everybody what a conflict it is to be a human being who desires. What was the rest of the question? It was really about why literary writers evade it. Well, I don't think they do. I mean, I grew up at a time during the 60s when people like Philip Roth William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, etc., wrote about sex all the time, and I think we have to carry on writing about sex. I think it's really important to write about sex all the time because we are desiring creatures, and the way in which we desire, and the way in which our desire is prohibited, particularly, for instance, let's say in the Muslim world, and the way it's distorted and forbidden. I think this is one of the most important subjects that there can be, that we can live in a world in which governments can tell you and religions can tell you when and where you can have sex. I mean, how absurd is that? How ridiculous is that? So I think it's very important that anybody with a mind or anybody with a literary intention should engage with these attitudes. And I think these attitudes are, as you suggest, they are political, actually. They are about institutions forbidding individuals, men and women, for making love in the way they wish to. And even worse than that, most of the people who do the forbidding are celibate. I can't think of anything worse.
Thank you. Yes? Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you for a really, really stimulating talk. Once a year, I get to perform, if that's the right word, the shortlist of the Bad Sex Awards, which is given by a literary magazine, the Literary Review, and it's meant to discourage people from writing badly written sex. So what I'd like to know from the panel is whether they would encourage the establishment of a good sex award to encourage better writing of sex, just as is produced by the four of you.
It's a great question. Nick?
Well, I think I won one of those bad sex awards at one point. So I thought, you know, I don't know what, sometimes in one mood it's bad writing about sex, in one mood it's good writing about sex. I never understand it. It's very hard to know. Of course, it's always good to have a fresh look, and so I would, yes, certainly encourage a more positive way of looking at writing. I remember when I came out with the Fermata, people who had liked some of my earlier books, my non-sexual books, I remember one woman ended her review, "Goodbye, Nicholson Baker, goodbye forever." You know, and it was sort of as if I had just crossed the line, and that I was taboo. I was out. I was not good. I was shunned. You know, and I won the Bad Sex Award, and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I'm here, you know. So maybe it was a good thing.
Well, I must admit, I would hate to win the Bad Sex Awards, or I'm sure you would perform it beautifully. I have seen you perform them, and it's very funny. But I would hate to win it. But I think it would be nice to have an award for the Good Sex Award. It would give us something to aspire to, I suppose. But I think, one thing the Bad Sex Award does is to show, not in your case, Nicholson, it was obviously a mistake the year you were on it, but I think you often get very big names on that list, and I think it does show the pitfalls of writing about sex, you know, how easy it is to suddenly tumble into some dreadful metaphor, or, you know, just some very hackneyed phrase, or just something that's too anatomical. It is very easy to write horribly about sex. But that's part of the challenge, isn't it? That's part of the challenge of trying to write well about sex, I think.
Just one sec. Good Sex Awards, thoughts on?
Yes, I think, but it's really awkward and to write well about sex. It's hard. The act itself, you can go, you know, pre-post, but the actual thing. So I don't know. I think it would be something exciting, possibly. So yeah.
Yeah, as you said, it's very cool nowadays to write about sex, and it's almost cool not to write about sex. And it's like, if you're not having sex, then you're not happening, or it's not happening for you. So my question to anyone on the panel is, isn't there a certain value in abstinence, or do you think so or not?
Ooh, in a literary sense or in a general sense?
Well, abstinence
in writing about, even in writing about that.
Can we make abstinence cool again?
Yeah.
Well, remember when you're reading a book, for that moment, while you're thinking about the words and decoding the words on the page, you're being abstinent. You know, that is a moment. I tried to, in the last book that I wrote that was really dirty called House of Holes, I imagined this group of people called deprivos. And they were people who were forced to be deprived of all sex for a long period of time. And they were all sort of hanging out on balconies while women walked past and stuff. I found it exciting. I don't know. I think not being able to have sex, being forced not to think the thoughts you want to think, is sometimes really exciting.
Well, I think it's really interesting at the moment because, as many of you know, we live in a world of very political and radical Islam, for instance. And one of the things that the radical Islam thinks about, and it thinks about all the time, is pleasure. It thinks about pleasure all the time, mostly, as I'm sure you're aware, in the negative. But it seems to me that when we're living in a time of let's say, anti-pleasure fascism, and that aspect of Islam really is a death cult, and it really is extreme fascism. It seems to me that we also have to have, as it were, a resistance from the side of pleasure against anti-pleasure. So I feel that it's partly our duty to try and keep pleasure alive, and that this in the present context, the love of sensuality, the love of physicality, the love of living, the love of desiring, the love of our bodies, and a sexual love for one another, seems to me almost now to have become more and more in the political context of a political act. So remember that. Every time you are fucking, you are defeating political Islam.
But just to think about pleasure, we've all had the experience of having unpleasant sex, you know, and we've all had periods of abstinence, including within a marriage sometimes, you know. So that is part of life, abstinence. And so I think that, you know, that deserves to be addressed as well, definitely.
Well, I don't think it's just, Hanif said Islam, but it's also, you know, Hindu religion. So, you know, to say, yeah, you keep going for it. So, yeah.
Maybe if yes?
Somebody over there has a question.
My question to Mr. Baker is, sir, where do we draw a line between reading and writing about sex and reading and writing vulgarity? Where do we draw a line between intimacy and obscenity? Or is it the goal of our society to treat nothing as vulgar and obscene?
Well, that's a tricky question. I mean, in some ways, I think I decided to put aside whether what I was doing was pornography, was vulgar, was obscene, or whether it was literary, because I just felt that I didn't want to think about that while I was writing it. I just wanted to write the best book I could possibly write, the best dirty book I could possibly write. I had a lot to say. You know, I wanted to say what was true. And sometimes what is true is a mixture of what's vulgar and what is embarrassing and what is maybe a new metaphor or something. Sometimes it's a mixture of all sorts of things. But you also have to say that, I mean, you know, it's nice to write about sex. It's nice to be thought of as a person who writes about sex. I'm embarrassed because I'm 58, I've got a white beard, and still people are asking me to be on panels and talk about sex. But even so, you know, the real goal of life is to find a nice person to be friends with, you know. And the sex is fine, but that's one tiny piece of the hugeness of life. And so, I mean, in some ways, if you just write a book that's pornographic and vulgar, you're doing a service because you're kind of being exuberant. Exuberance is beauty. On the other hand, you're misrepresenting life. You're saying, this is all there is. But of course it's not. You're looking for a person to talk to for the rest of your life. That's what it's all about.
Yes?
Hi, my question is to Hanif. So from Lady Chatterley's Lover being banned to 50 Shades of Grey being a huge hit, would you like to comment on how probably sex is not a taboo topic anymore and probably is hugely accepted now, going by 50 Shades of Grey. It's going to be made into a movie and all. So,
Yeah, it's coming out on Valentine's Day. Yes, I think, well, we've been over all this, and I think it's become really banal. And I think making sex banal is probably a way of trying to get rid of it. Because I think sex really is revolutionary, and I really think it's dramatic, and it really can change people. But putting it everywhere, in that sense, makes it banal, and in a sense, makes it far less powerful, actually, than it should be. It seems to me now that it's much more interesting to write about love. You know, I've got many friends, particularly gay friends, who have sex with hundreds of people all the time, and you think, well, it's pointless. That's not really interesting at all to me now. But what would be really interesting if one night you fell in love? Then your life would really change. That would be really revolutionary. Imagine writing a book about love, two people falling in love. How dramatic would that be?
From where this basic instinct sex origin? What is the origin of that sex? Can you tell me?
Of the origin of the title of the panel?
Basic instinct sex.
I think it refers to a movie, and I think it's a sort of, yeah, that's as far as just in honor of the great Sharon Stone.
What's interesting about sex is it's not an instinct, is it? You actually have to learn how to do it. It's not an instinct at all. That's why pornography comes in useful as a sort of instruction manual. Actually, nobody is born with the ability to have sex. Nobody really knows instinctively how to have sex. You have to learn from other people, and you carry on finding out how to do it. It's not an instinct in any sense at all.
I don't think that's true. I think it's a basic instinct. I do. I mean, I think I...
Do you?
I do. I thought something very strange was happening. And then I asked my mother, you know, where do babies come from? And she showed me this, she bought me this little paperback called Where Do Babies Come From? And it had a description of two chickens.
Chickens.
The two chickens. And it said that the male chicken positions himself onto the female chicken, and they have two little holes or something. And I thought, my God, this is the most exciting thing I've ever read. And I'm sure the chickens were enjoying it. And they hadn't read any pornography. I mean, they were just doing it. It's a basic thing that we know how to do, just the way we soak up language, sort of without any grammar books. We soak up how to do this really nice thing that we do. When it's good, it's good. You know?
That may be why you love KFC so much.
Oh, Hanif.
Any other?
Hi. I am sensing a certain kind of dichotomy and a contradiction among the panelists. Because on one level, Hanif says that sex is revolutionary and we have a duty to in a sense, to protect it. But interestingly, I note only the male panelist said this and associated, for some reason, the word sex with dirty. And I'm just wondering if that's a Freudian slip, or if it's social conditioning, or is there an inherent contradiction in the way that you approach sex?
I think am I the one? Am I the one who's...
I think she wanted to talk to both.
Well, there's definitely, I think there's a difference in the way, you know, a man approaches sex and a woman approaches sex. It's also the way you approach the world. You know, there's a sort of sense of swagger, this swollen ownership of the world that you know, at least Indian men have, or men have generally, and as a woman you just don't have that. Just the way you experience and negotiate the world is different, and that's the way you're going to also, well, this is the thing, you can penetrate and you can receive. That's the, you know, the basic difference. The sex, and I mean, there's a difference between sex and physiology, but there's also a difference in the way you maneuver yourself as a woman. You know, you protect yourself. There are limits.
Women can do penetration.
Yes, I know.
We'll talk about this later.
But, well, moving on.
Male panelists?
I think one thing we haven't mentioned is that I think it's a very different experience being a woman and being a man writing about sex, for those reasons that you're talking about, where you start from and how you do it, but also the kind of reputation you acquire once you're published, because I think women writing about sex tend to get talked about in a slightly different way and maybe over-identified with the sex in their books. Wouldn't you say that women are vulnerable to that kind of... Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think for anybody writing about sex, there's this people weirdly identify you with the sex. I mean, I've written about murder. I don't think anybody ever, thinks of me as a murderer. But, I hope not anyway. But, I think anyone who writes about sex, somehow it's seen as very exposing. It's exposing something about the way you have sex yourself or something.
Yeah, you do expose yourself. There's almost like, I think, a masochistic thrill, though, in that level of exposure. Once you write about it, and once it's out there, it's just out there. So there's a certain kind of power as well in exposing at that level. So.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for our incredible panelists for being so generous with their time.
Thank you.
It's wonderful.
Thanks, Parul.
Thanks to Hanif Kureishi, Deepti Kapoor, Sarah Waters, and Nicholson Baker, and also to